Hi, everyone, and welcome to Learning from History's Mistakes. I'm your host, Aaron Zebart, and today's episode is Listen to the Lorax, which discusses Dr. Seuss's well-known children's story, The Lorax, and the sad historic event known as the Dust Bowl. Now, I know what you're thinking. How in the world are the Dust Bowl and the Lorax related at all? Or maybe, what on earth is the Dust Bowl? A bowl of dirt? Now, if you were thinking the second option, let me help you out a bit. The Dust Bowl is an event in history that happened during the Great Depression. Let me back up here, since there's a good chance that a few or more listeners out there may not have paid close attention during history class. So we'll start with a very brief description of the Great Depression. According to the very knowledgeable editors at History.com, the Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from 1929 to 1939. It began after the stock market crash of October 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. Over the next several years, consumer spending and investment dropped, causing steep declines in industrial output and employment as failing companies laid off workers. By 1933, when the Great Depression reached its lowest point, some 15 million Americans were unemployed, and nearly half of the country's banks had failed. Now, just hearing about it makes you feel depressed, doesn't it? Well, it gets worse. In the middle of that terrible economic crash, the record-breaking unemployment, things were getting really bad in our nation's Midwest. Kimberly Amadeo is the U.S. economy expert for The Balance. She does a great job explaining the Dust Bowl on thebalance.com. The Dust Bowl is a natural disaster that devastated the Midwest in the 1930s. It was the worst drought in North America for 1,000 years. Unsustainable farming practices worsened the drought's effect. It killed the crops that kept the soil in place. When winds blew, they raised enormous clouds of dust. It deposited mounds of dirt on everything, then covering houses. Dust suffocated livestock and caused pneumonia in children. At its worst, the storm blew dust to Washington, D.C. The drought in the Dust Bowl destroyed a large part of the U.S. agricultural production. The Dust Bowl made the Great Depression even worse. So far we've covered a lot of bad news, but we haven't said a thing about Dr. Seuss. While every American child probably has at least one favorite Dr. Seuss book, probably not everyone knows that Dr. Seuss was also a political cartoonist. And guess what? Political cartoonists have opinions. Dr. Seuss had strong opinions too, and some of them even showed up in his children's stories. Well, today we're talking about his popular book, The Lorax. The Lorax definitely has a message for its readers. It's too bad it wasn't written in the 1930s because its message would have been useful for Midwestern farmers. Let me explain why. A main character from the Lorax is called the Onceler. He comes across a glorious place filled with truffula trees. Those truffula trees. The Midwest in the early 1900s was pretty glorious itself. The soil was rich and fertile, and there was plenty of land for everyone, or so it seemed. The Onceler immediately started making use of the truffula trees by chopping them down and making something called a thneed. The Midwestern farmers immediately started planting and harvesting wheat. Neither slowed down. The Onceler expanded hired workers, built the factory, and kept chopping. The farmers expanded, got bigger equipment, and plowed more and more land. There is a popular phrase that says, "All good things must come to an end." The farmers and Onceler may have thought it was good at the time, but it actually was not. especially not for the environment. And sadly, all of them found their resources coming to an end. No more truffula trees and no more fertile soil. They had been warned. Agricultural and economic experts from the nation's capital had visited Midwestern farmers to discourage them from plowing more land, warning them that it could be disastrous when the Great Depression hit. They urged farmers to not send more wheat into the market because it would actually drive down the value. But the farmers didn't listen. They just plowed more and planted more wheat because they needed more money to survive, and they didn't believe the depression would affect them. This is when reading the Lorax to their children every night in bed might have helped the farmers get the message. Unfortunately, their desperation was stronger than the experts' power of persuasion, which is similar to what happened with the Lorax and the Onceler. The Lorax warned the Onceler repeatedly to stop polluting the environment and using up the trees. In the Lorax movie, the Onceler began to realize his mistake, but greed was stronger than his conscience. And in both the book and the movie, the Onceler ignored all warnings and continued chopping. Their bad decisions had consequences on everyone around them. In the Lorax, the Onceler drove the Barbaloots away because the truffula trees were their food source. The Swanee swans were driven away by the bad air, no longer able to sing or breathe. The humming fish had to leave because their water was so full of trash. Even the relatives left. There were no needs left to be made. For the Dust Bowl, the wild animals' ecosystem was totally disrupted. People got very sick from the dust in their lungs. Weaker people, including children, even died from illnesses caused by the dust. Farm animals such as cattle rapidly died off, and the once beautiful land became literally covered with dirt. Now, if you've stayed with me this long, listening to all the horror, then congratulations to you for your perseverance. Your reward is hearing a somewhat happy ending, at least for the Dust Bowl. Midwestern farmers eventually listened to the expert. They accepted offers from the federal government to be paid for not plowing. They also eventually adopted healthier farming practices, including plowing methods, crop rotation, and more. If you visit the Midwest today, you'll see that farming is healthy and thriving. In the Lorax, the ending isn't exactly happy, but it gives us hope. The Onceler gave the very last truffula tree seed to a young child and told him to care for it. He believed the next generation could restore the environment and bring back the truffula trees without the Thneeds. And that's the moral to our story, too. I didn't tell you about history just to make you snooze. There are lessons to be learned from every historic tale. Tune in next time to learn more from history's fails. A word from our writer.
For those who want to learn more about the Dust Bowl, view Ken Burns' exceptional documentary series called, you guessed it, The Dust Bowl. This is the source of most of my personal knowledge on the topic.